Good morning, everyone, and all the participants to our webinar. It's regarding monitoring evaluation, how to measure the success of adaptation processes. If you can confirm that everybody can listen, I'm sorry for the technical problem. Well, it is a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for your participation. My name is Lili Lieva, and I have the pleasure to moderate the webinar of today. First, I'd like to give you some technical indications for this webinar platform that we're using for the participants who have not used this before. Presentations can be listened in English and in Spanish with simultaneous translation. This can be done. You can choose your language with the button that it's located in the bottom part on the right side where it says choose your language. If you have any problems with the audio or any other problems with the platform, you can refresh the website, or you can write to our technical assistant going to the question mark on the bottom part on the left side. Now, so again, it's a pleasure to welcome you from the community about the national plans regarding climate change adaptation. The community is an initiative of the UN environment through the Regatta project. Implemented in collaboration with Practical Action. It has the aim to support the public officers, researchers, and other professionals in the preparation of the plans, the national adaptation plans for climate change in Latin America and in the Caribbean. In regards to the structure of the webinar, we have the pleasure to welcome 3 experts in the topic of monitoring and evaluation of adaptation processes. After the different expositions, we will have questions and answers, so I will thank you if you could wait until that moment so you can write your questions. I can tell you that we will share these presentations and also the audio of this webinar a few days later after the webinar. Saying that, this webinar will try to answer some of the questions regarding monitoring and evaluation of the different adaptation processes. One of the questions is, what are the challenges associated with the adaptation process that we are monitoring? Are the processes or maybe the results of the adaptation, what metrics can we use to evaluate the process and the efficacy of these adaptation plans? What good examples we have here in Latin America? And also the webinar of today is looking to present the progress and experiences in regard of that topic. And we will present progress in regards to about the metrics about measuring adaptation, and also we will show a case study of Mexico in regards to the creation of a monitoring system and also an evaluation system. For that, we have invited Elena Pita, who is the Program Officer of Adaptation for Latin America and the Caribbean. And the UN, also we have invited Lars Christensen, expert in climate change and the Senior Project Officer for the UNEP-DTU Partnership. And also we have invited Maria Soraya Ramos. She's a researcher for the Global Climate Change and Sustainability from Mexico. And she's also the coordinator of the GEF UN Environment Project for the strengthening of capabilities for the implementation of national strategy about biodiversity. It is a pleasure now to welcome Elena Pita, who is the Adaptation Program Officer from the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, UN Environment. So she can welcome us, and also a brief introduction about the topic about monitoring and about adaptation processes. Thank you very much. Well, good morning. Welcome to this webinar. As Lila has explained before, my mission here is to give some introductory words to give you a context in regards about the monitoring and in regards to climate change. For that, I just wanted to explain three things. First is the importance about the global importance, and also a few examples about the work that we are doing. The importance of the monitoring and evaluation at global level, it's evident because after the Paris Agreement, the adaptation is a high level in the international agenda. All the countries from Latin America have included the adaptation in the index, in the indices. That's where there's new requirements for the fulfillment of the different commitments. We have to be able to show that we are not only implementing adaptation actions, but also how and if we are going through the right path. At local level, the implementation of this is also evident because the different processes and initiatives of adaptation happen at local level, and we have to be able to design indicators and frameworks and monitoring frameworks of transparency, and they can be real, they can be measured, that require of accessible data, and also they have to be able to show the progress and also give us an idea of how we are adapting. In order to finish this introduction, I just wanted to give you some examples of this type of activities, since the monitoring and evaluation is a priority for all our countries, or the partner countries in Latin America. And from the UN environment, we're providing support through different modalities. One of them is exchange of knowledge online. This webinar is an example of this, but also we have other communities of practice of regatta. For example, if you're interested, you can find information about how monitor and evaluate adaptation. For example, there's a module dedicated to that based on ecosystems, and there's a practical community in regards to a module about the indicators of adaptation. Another modality of support is through different studies and publications. We are supporting through internet, and also we provide information. Another example is the study that is about to be presented, that it's been done. DTU is a collaboration center from the environment, which is specifically dedicated to the monitoring and evaluation of adaptation, or also studies done regarding CTN. For example, the support to the development of the adaptation indicators in Colombia. So there are different ways of working with other countries. Also, we are doing workshops, and not online. So last year we did workshops in which we dealt with this matter, and also later I will put in the documentation about the documents that we manage in these workshops, where we put in evidence that the high level of the priority that the monitoring and adaptation has, and also that this is a topic that many countries are facing at the same time. Therefore, it is very interesting for the cooperation, for the exchange of experiences, and also how different countries are finding solutions. In this sense, we have done also exchange of learning, visits in different countries, And last, in the support that UN Environment provides to countries in their national plans, we also do monitoring and a follow-up. To finish this brief introduction, I just wanted to tell you that at the end of April, on the 27th, there's going to be a workshop of a launching of what we call the Excellence Centers for Transparency. This workshop is going to be back-to-back to the meeting, the capacity building for transparency, which is an initiative from the GEF, through which we are funding transparency frameworks for different countries. And it's interesting to say that many of these transparency frameworks, although they are very oriented to mitigation and monitoring and verification of the mitigation commitments, but many countries are also including aspects of adaptation in these frameworks because they need to measure it in order to report the fulfillments. For example, Chile, Peru, Antigua and Barbuda, those are countries that have included it, and in others we are working in a parallel way, like Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic, in the preparation, or Honduras in the preparation in the national adaptation plans. So this would be the context and some examples of the UN Environment is doing. And next I will leave you with the experts who are going to provide a more theoretic focus on what is the state of the art in regards of this matter, and also an example, concrete example that I think is also very useful in order to understand the different problems and what solutions we can find. So thank you very much, and we'll continue with the webinar. And I'll be able to answer questions if you have any. Thank you very much, Elena, about telling us about the activities that UN Environment is doing at this moment, about the implementation of the national plans of adaptation, and also about the opportunities of the different actors that have in order to involve and also share experiences and knowledge. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to present our second expositor. Is his last person. He's expert in climate change. He's the officer. He's a senior project officer from UNEP DTU Partnership. Lasse has more than 10 years of experience in experience. A great part that he's been focused on the implementation and the evaluation of projects in the framework of the different countries in developed countries, especially in the climate change and adaptation funding. Last, he was also the chief editor of the series that is called Perspectives about Adaptation Metrics. The publication is called So this publication has been launched on March 2018. So Lars will provide more information about this publication and the results and the lessons learned. Thank you very much, Lars. So now you can start.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for inviting me. I think I've already been properly introduced. So yes, I'll, as mentioned, I'll come back to that publication that was done very recently. So I'll jump here. Hope you can hear me. Otherwise, I hope someone will tell me. So I'll start up with why are we having this discussion in the first place about adaptation metrics. And in my view, I think there are three main needs in the arena of adaptation that points at adaptation metrics. And the first one is that we need to prioritize the limited funding that we have for the most vulnerable countries and population. Basically, as I mentioned here, getting the most adaptation per dollar. So we have all these adaptation funds, and we don't have enough funding for everyone. So how do we prioritize where to put our money? And we need metrics for that. The other point is that we have, at this point, have been working on funding adaptation and implementing adaptation for quite a long time. And so we're getting a more and more mature portfolio of projects and adaptation activities. So the question comes up, did we achieve what we set out to do? So as I put in these 2 points, there is the documentation of the results, what we also called MRE. And there is the generally learning from what we have done, what have we done right and what have we not done so right. And the third point, we need metrics for that. And the third point is that we need, in the context of the Paris Agreement, as you all know, I'm sure, there is a definition of a global goal on adaptation. And this is a new thing that was never defined before. And this will come up in the global stocktake in the years to come. Are we on track to achieving this global goal on adaptation? And we also need some kind of metrics for answering that question. So all of these questions need some kind of, and I call it here units of measurement, which is our definition of metrics. I'll come back to that. But we need that kind of unit of measurement for answering these questions in a quantitative way. And this is actually saying the same thing. It's just a different way of presenting it. To put it into the context of the UNFCCC and also with the chronological process. So as I mentioned, in 2001, as is in the figure, we had the definition of these new adaptation special UNFCCC funds. The Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, and Adaptation Fund. And with that, we had, as I mentioned, starting to have a need for prioritizing. So that's that point, started there. Then, as I mentioned, over time, with needing for having accountability of these projects, we need metrics to monitor and evaluate adaptation action. And recently, with the Paris Agreement, as seen in the last arrow, we need metrics to evaluate our collective process on adaptation. And this figure is taken also from one of the articles in the publication mentioned. So here it is. To further explore some of these questions around metrics, we decided here at UDP to commission a new, we call it perspective publication. We did that in 2017 and it was just released 2 weeks ago, so it's very brand new. The idea of these perspectives is basically to kickstart an emerging topic, something that is of great importance for international discussion, but something that is still relatively undeveloped. In this particular case, it collects articles, so it's not written by us, but we've written one of the articles and we've written the editorial, but otherwise it's written by a number of international experts and practitioners. And the idea is for them to offer their unique personal insights and reflections on this question, which is really the core question of our publication. How can we measure, aggregate, and compare climate change adaptation needs and results across activities, countries, and sectors? So that points at all of those three needs that I just mentioned. Just to advertise a little bit more on the publication, I mean, the unique features of this compared to others that would talk about the same is we consider this to have a more free format. So it's a little more opinion-based. You don't need to have the same strict standards in terms of what you can say and what you can't say as you would have in an academic publication. And another unique feature is that it collects insights from both experts. There's one part that talks about concepts and methodology, and then there's another part which is really from practitioners reflecting on the same question. So those are people in the country, in communities, working at different levels, talking about how they actually do this in practice. So I think that gives a broader perspective on everything. And I really deliberately put this disclaimer in here that we'd never had the intention, and we really do not provide a clear answer to the question that we put in there. The objective is just to provoke a discussion and to facilitate thinking on this, and so it's interesting what's in there, but it's not. Don't expect the big shiny answer to everything. So I'll jump ahead here. So to take a step back to the fundamental concept that we are discussing today, which is metrics. What we found a few things in working on this publication. The first of all is that it's actually surprisingly how unclear the definition of adaptation metrics is. We couldn't find any formal definitions anywhere, and there isn't really one definition that prevail in the practical discussions either. So it's a little bit of what is it? It's actually not completely clear. It's often, we found, used interchangeably with a number of related terms, like indicators, which is probably fine, but then what is the difference between an indicator and a metric? And that, again, is not completely clear. So given that we have this somewhat unclear definition, we decided to keep our main focus on that question I mentioned before, on comparing and measuring, comparing, and aggregating adaptation results, and to basically take a more practical definition, our own practical definition of what metrics is, and we consider it to be basically a unit of measurement with which we quantify an indicator. So, for example, this would give you some kind of different way to differentiate between what an indicator and a metric is. So we would consider an indicator, for example, to be, the example here, level of climate change vulnerability in a given population, and then you could have a metric that would be some kind of specific designated vulnerability index value. Or it could be an indicator of resilience of crop yields to climate change-induced drought, and the metric would be something specific like water use in cubic meters or tons of harvest, so something that can be quantified. So that would be one way of having a definition. At least that's the way we have chosen to define it, and it seems to be consistent with the way most authors are using it, but definitely not all. So just take this as our attempt at getting some kind of definition. I think I will just skip ahead then. So first of all, talking about metrics, it's important to realize that a lot of the context around the discussion of transparency and metrics are really rooted in the mitigation discussion of the UNFCCC. But the two things, mitigation and adaptation, as I'm sure you know, they're very different. They have very different characteristics. So it's simply impossible to directly translate the principles and methodologies that we have in mitigation to adaptation when talking about transparency and metrics and measuring. So this table reflects just that. It's from the publication, from one of the overview articles, which basically compares the characteristics of mitigation and adaptation and how they're different and why they're different. And I don't have time to go through all of this, but one of the key ones is the one that called place dependence of definition of measurement unit. So basically, the main difference is that in mitigation you have one universally applicable unit of comparison, which is CO2, that you can convert everything to CO2 and you can compare and aggregate and in that fashion. But for adaptation, of course, the objective of adaptation and the results of adaptation are very context specific, and it doesn't really, in most people's minds at least, make sense to have one unit, some kind of universal metric that you can convert everything into. But that's part of the discussion, of course. So just to have that in mind, that all of this discussion is rooted and in mitigation. So this is another table from the publication. from this overview article, which I think is useful. It really collects and discusses. It draws out all the main pitfalls or the problems, I think is a better term maybe, of using adaptation metrics. And it suggests some important parameters for improving the M&E of adaptation, which is the one part that's called potentials. In terms of the problems, they've loosely organized it around the IPCC definition of what is the use of adaptation metrics. The IPCC speaks of 3 different needs or uses of adaptation metrics. They talk about identifying needs, they talk about tracking implementation, and talk about assessing achievements. So the first one is sort of outside of that, which is it says that there's no single metric. That's basically what I just said. That compared to mitigation, we don't have that one unifying unit of measurement. But actually, that is somehow challenged by some of the authors. So I would say that's not that's their conclusion. It's not necessarily everyone's conclusion. The second one, the no single way to identify adaptation needs mentioned here, reflects the IPCC definition on the purposes of adaptation metrics, the identify needs. It basically says that if you're trying to apply simple criteria in identifying needs, then you are definitely going to overlook and probably important context-specific aspects of adaptation. The third point is also related to this identify needs. It's basically saying, there's limited applicability of vulnerability indices in allocating funding. In the very little guidance that is there in the UNFCCC for the adaptation funds, for example, is that funding should primarily go to the particularly vulnerable countries, but then that beckons the question, what is a particularly vulnerable country? And it hasn't been, even during all those years, there hasn't been really any success in getting anywhere closer to defining criteria for how to assess that. So what they're saying is that it's very difficult to imagine allocation of funding in a non-normative or in an objective manner. So that's another problem. The fourth one is in the risk of it's related to the second point from the IPCC, the tracking of implementation. There's clear risk when we're talking about metrics of adaptation of tracking outputs. What is being done rather than outcome and impacts. They're also mentioning that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation M&E. It really depends. The purpose of the methodology you use and the metrics that you use really depends on the purpose of why you are doing M&E. So it could be learning, it could be documentation of results, it could be supporting adaptive management decisions, and so forth. So that's another problem or pitfall. The sixth one it talks about how aggregation. It's about assessing achievements. The third point from IPCC, how aggregation leads to oversimplification. So it's basically about whether in terms of measuring adaptation, and assessing achievements, whether or not we are interested only in quantitative results or qualitative results. So when we're assessing what we have achieved, are we only interested in getting a number? Or are we only interested in getting, or are we also interested in understanding the specific context? And they're saying that there's this aggregation implies some kind of a number and figures being put on it, and which means that you're going to lose some of that qualitative information. And finally, metrics does not explain why changes are taking place. So we really, again, it's about simplifying. By using metrics, there's a real risk of simplifying complexity. On the positive side, they're talking about what are the potentials, what are the parameters that we can use for improving M&E for adaptation. One point is how national M&E systems can inform learning and decision making going forward. So it can be a useful tool for improving decision making at the national level. It speaks also about, in the second point, about how let me see. Yeah, the potential. There's a potential for improved alignment of M&E and metrics across policy themes. So, for example, we can maybe to a higher degree use existing indicators and processes. So it could be both at the international level, like the indicators and metrics that have been defined under the SDGs and the Sendai Agreement, but it could also be nationally existing development metrics, as I'll come back to in a bit. Then they recommend that improved design of M&E. There could be an improved design of M&E to facilitate learning. So they're basically saying that M&E shouldn't be, as it is now, maybe mostly about documentation, but actually also we should remember that M&E has another important quality to it, which is to provide new insights on the adaptation process. So it's about learning what did we do right and what did we do wrong, and maybe we need to design the M&E and the metrics better to facilitate that learning. And then they also talk about transformational adaptation and how we can design M&E and metrics to provide better understanding of how these systemic changes can happen. I'm sorry, it's probably a little a very quick rundown and maybe not fully exhaustive, but I recommend going into that article to get a better understanding of each of these points. So on the whole of course, this publication that we did has covered a lot of themes, a lot of different things, both methodological and conceptual articles, and practical experience being shared. So we looked in the editorial about what are the key findings and trends in these articles. So as I mentioned, we don't have any really clear conclusions on what is adaptation metrics, what are the adaptation metrics we used, how should we design them, and how should we implement them. But we can see some trends and some learning coming out of it. And one of the key trends that we see in the articles is the struggle to find a balance between conceptual and methodological questions and the practical reality and the pragmatism needed to implement M&E and MRE in practice in a real context. So on one side, adaptation is a unique local process, which is quite hard to fit with the generic models. On the other hand, if we make the models that we design too flexible, they often end up, and this is I think something that we've seen in the articles, they often end up actually being so flexible that they don't really give any specific, not specific enough at least, guidance for how to apply it locally. So there becomes this gap between rock and a hard place. Either you make the models very very strict and very generic or very specific, but then they don't really. They're difficult to adapt to a local reality, but if you make them very flexible and very open, then those that are at the other end and needing to implement them in practice and put them into practice, they may find it difficult because there isn't really enough specific guidance included. So that's one finding at least. It's also very clear from these articles the importance of context. Basically, the purpose of why we are measuring adaptation, and consequently also what we are measuring, really depends on the context. For example, the needs in a local or project context is very different from what we need for example, the global adaptation goal, or if you are trying to have an overview of a portfolio and what a portfolio have achieved. So is it possible, that's a question that comes out in many of the articles, is it possible to have frameworks that achieve both at once? I mean, the aggregability and both meeting the needs locally and at project levels and globally and larger aggregate levels? Or do we need some kind of different approach? And another thing that comes out is how we call it the hodgepodge in English, how many methodologies and frameworks actually exist out there, even generic ones, which is both a matter of the duplication, but also it's just very confusing, I think, for anyone trying to find guidance out there. So this really highlights the need for some kind of global consensus on how we are going to handle these things, so we can have a more unified approach. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the universal metrics. Is it possible, meaningful, to have just one single unit of comparison? And if it's not, then we are actually faced with some kind of problems in terms of how do we then prioritize funding? How do we compare apples and oranges, so to speak? So that was just a very brief, some key findings that we had. Then to go a little bit deeper in the and I'm very aware of the time. I'm sorry, I've been taking too long here. We have two sections, as I mentioned, and the one that is probably most relevant here is the one that talks about the practical experiences and lessons. And loosely they're organized into scale. So we have one that focuses on local level, one that is focused on project level, and then we have two that are focused on the national level and national monitoring systems. We have one that is more on the national levels and linking to the international level on the technology needs assessment project, and then we have one that is focused on practical experiences from a portfolio or donor perspectives at GIZ. So I think the one that's more interesting here is probably the national level. So I just quickly try to drag out some main conclusions here. Maybe I'll skip Germany and just focus on Kenya, since I'm out of time. We have just some general observations on these two case studies that we have from Kenya and Germany. They have very different contexts in terms of data availability and institutional capacity and budget capacity, obviously, in these two countries. A common lesson, however, is the importance of basing national adaptation M&E systems on existing data and processes. And this is both to reduce the costs, obviously, and to avoid duplication of collecting data. But more importantly, they find that it has actually helped them improve the integration of adaptation into general national planning development. So by using using data and using indicators that are already existing in their national context for adaptation purposes and adapting them to whatever needs are relevant, they're actually helping improve the integration of adaptation into planning. On Kenya, quickly, I think this is a very nice example, although it's not completely fully implemented yet. Kenya has developed a national climate change action plan in 2013, and they designed a national system to aggregate adaptation data called MRV Plus to support that action plan. Then there was a delay in terms of getting that implemented. So they had a feasibility. They basically had a study to test this system in one county, or one at sort of a regional level or sub-regional level in Kenya, which enabled them to refine the framework to use in the Kenyan NAP, which they completed in 2016. And the final NAP indicator framework, it consists of multiple levels of indicators. So it's actually a nice example of how they are at least trying to aggregate between levels and how they are trying to consider this context-specific nature of adaptation. So they have one level which is the NAP. They call the NAP indicators, which is at the national level. So they have national indicators which are based on national statistics and data collection. They have sector indicators with the same, and then they have one level of indicators in the NAP indicators which are aggregating data from what is supposed to be sub-national data or M&E systems at each of the counties. So they will drag out from each of those county systems. They will drag out some general indicators or general results in quantitative form, but it will not sort of limit themselves to having just the aggregate data, but there is actually a whole system at the county level behind that, which has the sort of the more specific and relevant full data for the county level. So then they have the second level is the county level indicators, which have specific indicators focused at the county level and what is relevant and needed there. And one element of that is actually also, again, to have aggregate indicators which will be dragged out from community level data. So there's a third level also in this, where at the community level there will be different indicators being collected, which can then be aggregated and in some kind of quantitative form will feed into the county level indicators. So it does sort of aim to address some of those context problems of how do you take into consideration both the needs of national and global levels and local levels. So I think I'll just skip ahead here because I just put in the examples. Here's the NAP indicators. You can go back and read them eventually. Here's the example of the county level indicators. As mentioned, at the bottom there is the indicators that are aggregated from the community level. And then here's example of very local community level indicators, which are really focused more on well-being partly. So something that really makes sense in a local context, something they can understand and something that makes sense to them. So they can have an understanding of what is going on and something. So I think I probably should just stop here, unless someone else someone tells me otherwise, because I'm very much out of time, I think.
Muchas gracias, Lars.
Lars, and I'm sorry that if you could provide some conclusions, final words, so we can have time for the next presenter. So in a few minutes, if you could take, I'm confirming that we're going to share all the expositions and also the audio of this webinar. So, and any other resource that comes from these presentations. So, Lars, if you could provide some conclusions and lessons learned. Thank you very much.
Yes, sure. I think the general conclusions and lessons learned, I included that already in terms of what we found. I mean, general things and trends from the articles in the Perspectives publication. What is missing, I just skipped that slide, but I mean, lessons learned from Kenya, maybe I can go through that. But I think really the key message here is as I mentioned, this importance of context, which is as I mentioned is to some extent at least being considered here, how difficult it is to find a framework that works at all levels. So something that both feeds into those needs that you have at a global level, like prioritizing funding and assessing the progress on global adaptation goals and so forth in somehow an aggregate quantitative form, and at the same time having indicators and metrics that work and make sense at the local level, even at the very local level, at the community level, of something that is understandable and something that is not so aggregate that it doesn't make any sense. And I think this is the sort of the practical challenges that are being faced in Kenya, in Germany, in many of the articles that we are and the case studies that we're seeing here, and that people are struggling with. I don't. As I mentioned, I can't promise any large sort of golden conclusions that will just solve everything. So we're just getting started, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Lars, for providing all this information in regards to the publication and what are the challenges and the practical challenges in theory and practical challenges in regards to identifying metrics to learn more about how this process of adaptation is being developed. Thank you very much also for sharing some of the examples of Kenya. And also we will have also Germany was also included. With saying that, now I'd like to introduce our next presenter from Mexico, who will present an example, a practical example from Mexico. Maria Soria Ramos, she's a researcher from Mexico. She's also coordinator of the Genf UN Environment Project to strengthen capacities for the implementation of the National Strategy on Biodiversity. And Maria, she will present about the measuring the process of adaptation to climate change, and in a few moments, just so we can upload her presentation. Thank you very much, Maria. I'm sorry, if you could, we will have to take a few minutes in order to resolve the audio. We have some problems with the audio. In the meanwhile, just wanted also to comment you that we're going to share all this material. We have shared the link of the publication that Lars commented, so you can also have more details about this topic. Well, thank you if you could wait a few seconds so we can resolve this audio problem. Thank you very much. I see that there is the option of having maybe some questions. Just in a few seconds, I'm going to try again if we can connect again with Maria. And in case we can connect with her, we'll continue with the webinar. Otherwise, we'll give some minutes for the questions. Well, I think we'll have to wait a few more minutes so we can get some of your questions for Elena Pita and also for Lars Christensen. So if you could write down your questions, if you can write on the chat, you could write it either in English or in Spanish. There's an automatic translation that can translate your questions. If you can write also that your question is going either to Lars or to the other speaker. There's a question that I'm gonna read here. It's from Luisa. What indicators and metrics have been built in order to evaluate the impact of adaptation measurements based on ecosystems of climate change? This question is for Lars Christensen, and came from Colombia. So Lars, I'm gonna pass to you if you could answer this question while we are seeing the issue of the audio for the next speaker. Thank you very much, Lars.
Okay. So it's a pretty broad question that maybe I would appreciate having some kind of direct communication with the Luisa who is asking. So I mean, I don't have any answer on hand but I mean, I am aware of several indicators that have been used in the context of ecosystems, like mangrove restoration, and I'm not sure if this is what the person asking is interested in, because there are generally specific metrics for local context. So you're replanting mangrove in a coastal area of Tanzania or something, and then you're looking for indicators to measure that. So yeah, it's a little difficult to answer, maybe. Sorry. I mean, I would prefer to have that some kind of communication with her. So I could...
Sí, de hecho es una pregunta bastante amplia, y deja también Elena Pita, como ella comentó en su introducción. En la comunidad de práctica de regata sobre adaptación basada en ecosistemas se puede encontrar información relevante sobre el módulo que está dedicado en el tema de monitoreo y evaluación. Ella también ha compartido un enlace. En esta comunidad de práctica hay una biblioteca con varios recursos y también varios ejemplos de indicadores especialmente que se pueden utilizar en el tema de adaptación basada en ecosistemas, así como hay un webinar que también da un poco más de información, y ahí también hay los contactos de algunos expertos en ese tema que también se pueden contactar para preguntar especialmente el tema de adaptación basada en ecosistemas. Y voy a dar la palabra a Elena Pita para poder dar más detalles sobre ese asunto.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Lili, y muchas gracias, Luisa, por la pregunta, que es muy interesante y muy relevante, puesto que es una pregunta que se hacen muchos gobiernos, muchos investigadores y muchos técnicos desde distintos puntos de vista. Yo creo que eso está muy relacionado con lo que comentaba Lars en su presentación de la especificidad de los indicadores de adaptación basada, de adaptación en general, porque la adaptación basada en ecosistemas depende de qué ecosistemas estemos hablando y de cuáles sean los impactos de cambio climático. Como son específicos para el contexto, pueden ser muy diferentes. En ese sentido, sí que os invito a profundizar en el módulo de la comunidad de adaptación basada en ecosistemas, y igualmente y a ver igualmente los documentos que se han que hay subidos en la plataforma, y me parece que el mensaje sobre cómo la adaptación no tiene un indicador único y cómo especifica el contexto que ha explicado Lars en su presentación, se entiende muy bien en este contexto, ¿no? Gracias. Veo que también. Gracias, Lili.
Un poco más de información sobre las posibilidades también de participar en una otra plataforma o comunidad de prácticas sobre adaptación basada en ecosistemas y la información que se puede encontrar allá. Muchas gracias. Ahora.
So now we have the audio for the presentation of María Zorrilla. So now we leave you with María, and excuse us for that inconvenience. Hola a todos, ¿me pueden escuchar? Hello everyone, can you hear me? It's great. Well, good morning. My name is María Zorrilla, and quickly I'm going to tell you a little bit what I've done in adaptation. I worked in this matter since 2010. We're working in the National Strategy of Adaptation and also for the climate change. And with the GIZ, I've done many interesting things. We've done a system of prioritization. And also we've been working on the different cases regarding gender issues. That case I'm not going to present it because I had just only to choose one. And also I'm going to work I've been working in strategies at national level with the state. For example, I work with the region in different states in the Yucatan Peninsula. So I'm going to share in this exposition, I hope it's not going to take me long, and share share a little bit of what is the policy of adaptation. And so the presentation is quite long. I'm not going to see it, but I just wanted you to have it, because so I'm going to skip some of them. So I'm just going to focus on some examples. Well, the first is, I do want to present this. When we're talking about the process of adaptation, we're talking about public policy. So in all public policies, they have, it's quite interesting, this public policy, because I know everybody does that. There could be adaptation or another topic, that in public policies there are 5 stages, but I like to talk about 5 stages. Is identify the problem, the formulation, the adoption of, then implementing them, and evaluating the results. But really the evaluation is very important of the policy. That's why indicators are very important. But when we have an idea of what we want to measure, we can impact in all the policies and all the public policy. Here there's some examples of why to evaluate, why to measure. I'm going to leave you, but if you have any questions, I can answer them later. But here there's something very important. In this slide, I'm talking about why indicators, what are indicators, how we identify indicators, and there's something very important. There's a lot of theory about indicators. There's not much about adaptation indicators, but we have to work about like the information that we have. For example, CEPAL has a lot of information, for example. And also here there's another document from 2005 about indicators. I think it's from Horrocks, a lady from Australia. So I invite you to look for that information. But what I want to tell you with this is that there's a little bit difference between the indicator is a sign, it's an information, and the index is it combines a series of indicators. For example, when you want to write index of vulnerability, there's an index of human development, but there's always a great temptation of building indexes. So in very complicated topics like climate change, I try to avoid indexes, and what I try to propose are systems of indicators. And I'm going to tell you about that now. So what is the difference between a system of indicators? The system indicators chooses different indicators that can help to explain a more complex situation. The index shows, it's kind of like a mathematical formula. So you can do an equation that has, so you can get just one number. What I'm going to present here is how we did a system of indicators for the adaptation for Mexico. These ones I'm skipping because they are a little bit repetitive. So let's talk about the indicator systems. So the GIZ, the German Cooperation Agency, was working about the different, between 2010 and 2012. So they were asking that in Mexico we could do a similar exercise. This is very important. The exercise was not done because of a petition by Mexico, but it was done by GIZ in order to do this analysis of systems. This is the document. Here, Mexico is not here, but this is the document in order to do the different systems of indicators. I'm just going to go quickly to how we did it. So when someone is about to start a system of indicators, for example, right now I'm in Mexico working the system of indicators for the National Strategy of Biodiversity. What I want to tell you is that the process I'm doing is very similar to the one that I did for adaptation system. There are steps that are almost the same. And then you can give it like that twist. So what the first we have to ask is, when we're doing an system, what are we going to monitor? What is our starting point? And if we want to add other actors, we need to identify those actors or the key players. even, for example, in adaptation based on ecosystems, that I know that there's like some questions in this panel, we need to know that there is not just like one institution or a person that has all this information. We need to bring more actors or players or experts so we can find not only the indicator but the topics that are relevant. So maybe this is the most important part. The steps here. I'm sorry. So what do we have to ask ourselves? So what is the objective or system of indicators? And there's a very important difference here. Sometimes we can ask that we want to do a system of indicators to measure adaptation. That's the case I'm going to present today. So the questions are very different to a system of indicators to measure politics. Why is that? When we have a public policy and we have an adaptation program already designed and we want to measure the progress, our questions or our indicators are going through the different action lines and through the objectives of these politics. But we want to measure a process like adaptation. Sometimes there are elements that they don't have an associated public policy. So this subtlety, I'm going to provide you a case. The case of the soil in Mexico. The problem of soil in Mexico doesn't have a public policy. If I want to measure a process of adaptation based on the public policy, I wouldn't have any indicator in regards to the state of the soil, of the regeneration or restoration of the soil, because there's no line of public policy that has that. But if I skip the public policy and I go directly to all the different factors that are important to measure adaptation, I will see that there are elements that don't have public policies, but we still need to measure them. What I've done is I started from what did we need to know if we adapted, independently if there's a public policy or not. So I do recommend that exercise because it's more complete. In the case of indicators of gender, I started with the strategy, the subnational strategy, which is and based on these actions, I looked for indicators, and I found that in reality that there weren't any gender clear actions, but I'm not going to tell you more about that. So I need to know what I'm going to measure, and what I have developed. So the first system of indicators I did was a system of indicators that was for sustainability. So it had the same complexity as a system of indicators for adaptation, because we were talking. Because in adaptation there are many topics, so we need to choose. I'm going to explain what any of the different steps. We need to understand what topics there are. We need to understand what sources of information there are. And I want to stop here because another thing that I've seen in the design of public policies and also in the design of systems, that if you start building indicators for everything, we won't have a monitoring of the indicators. Because measuring an indicator, it is very expensive and you need a lot of experience for that. So what we need to do is to do a mix of indicators that there are and they can be adjusted to our system, and indicators that maybe do not exist but you need them to build. And I'm going to provide some examples. So I'm going to try to conclude 10:25, I know, but so hopefully we can have other questions. So in that part of identification of indicators, the first thing I recommend you is to search for what are the systems of indicators that you have in your countries from all the topics that are related to adaptation. For example, here there's a table that I've made where I put here what institution is building what kind of system and how every time when they measure, and here I have all the different topics that I need for my process of adaptation, and based on that I need to find what are all these different systems of indicators that can help me. In Mexico, we have a lot of system of indicators. For example, I found specifically in the case of Colombia that not because I know the others, but in the case of Colombia, I looked for different indicators, and they found that they had a lot of systems of indicators. So first we need to do a list of everything we have in order to build. This is going to be like our raw material to build. So this is some examples of our systems of indicators. I recommend you that when you're about to do your system of indicators, to do this background. And then we can have this here slide, which is how we build a system from my perspective. Well, in fact, we did a manual with all these steps. I don't know if it's public, but I can ask him to GIC if I can share it. But so let's see step by step, and I can try to explain you. I have some slides about those, the most important processes. Well, the first is to design the system and see what are our objectives. What do I mean with that? My objective will be to measure the adaptation process. That's good. Or maybe it's going to be a subnational adaptation process. If it's going to be the adaptation process based on ecosystems, we have to have very clear what's going to be the focus of our system, because that's going to define everything. And these are different elements. So the key question for the system is important. Then we have to identify and we need all the theory of indicators, that they are efficient, that they are cost efficient, that can be measured. So I do recommend you to see the different publications from Ray Quiroga, because there are different guidelines how indicators need to be. And then to create the different methodological sheets, because these are some very important. The methodology sheets, it's like the metadata. When you have the metadata clearly identified, we will understand what are we dealing with. It's not easy to just like create indicators. All indicators, they have to be very well justified. So once we have this first step, the next part, it is very important, is to identify what themes and things are going to be part of our adaptation system. What do I mean with themes? And now I'm going to skip to the next part. For example, when we were doing the system of indicators in Mexico, I started first with my initial proposal was, okay, if we're going to measure adaptation, let's say what is going to happen with the social system or the ecological system and the economical system. So when I had meetings with experts, they were telling me like, no, it is much more complex. And then we got 7 huge topics. And the expert said we had to focus on adaptation of climate change. So now I'm going to tell you about these topics, but they were not only these topics. We were just thinking, what do we need to know if we're adapting as a country? We need information about climate information. Then also we need information about the ecosystems. We need to understand what is happening in the social system, in the productive system, but also we need to know, and this is very important, we need to know what is happening with the government capabilities, social capabilities, and what is happening with the damage and losses. And from then, we asked ourselves, okay, from all these different sub-themes, what do we need to know if we are adapting well as a country? And then all these sub-themes, they were like 40-something sub-themes. So imagine, it was a full system of indicators. You will need at least one indicator for all these sub-themes. So this is an example of the complexity of these indicators. And this was at national level, but at subnational level, this could have different focuses. For example, at subnational level, what changes? For example, that in the social system, there are like different indicators depending if it's a city or it's a rural area. For example, in rural area, access to education, it is important, but maybe in cities there's another topic that it's interesting. So that's when we see all the differences at regional and local level. Once we have identified what are the different topics and themes, I'm sorry, I need to go fast. Now, once we have the themes and sub-themes, we need this step. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Once we have identified, imagine we're still like on step 3. Now we need to identify something that people don't tell you, but it is very important to choose an indicator. It's not just identifying the topic. For example, terrestrial ecosystems. An indicator of terrestrial ecosystem is basically a percentage of ecosystems by territory or the grade of fragmentation, but these indicators depend on a key question, what I call it says the purpose of the indicative purpose. What is the indicative purpose? Is about the specific topic. What do we need if we know that we are adapting? I need to understand the percentage or of the coverage, or it's too broad. Or maybe I need to understand the connectivity. So this is where we're starting to do more adequate things. So once we do this, and starting from that question to it's what I'm telling you, that it deals with the identification of the indicator. So in the experience that we had with Mexico, we had these all 40-something sub-themes when we did the purpose of the different indicators of each sub-theme. That when we were proposing indicators that were new and indicators that were old, we had a matrix of 100 indicators that were proposed. This is impossible to do. And it is a recommendation, a clear recommendation. There's not a measure of a system of indicators, but if you have a system of indicators that is measured every single time, it cannot be more than 50. It has to be between 20 and 50. Why I'm telling you this number? Because measure every indicator, it costs money. Not only money, also time and experience. Also, a system of indicators is not only about measuring the indicator, but it is also about understanding what is the relation between all those indicators. My example about the system of indicator, that it's the nicest one, that it's not from adaptation. All the systems of adaptation indicators are being built now. You're not going to find systems that are complete. If you try to find systems of indicators, maybe the UK is the country that is going forward in that, and maybe also in Asia you'll find some interesting ones. But if you find systems of indicators of adaptation, you're going to find in building. And for example, in sustainability, there's one that is from Spain, that is the observatory from the sustainability of Spain, that has a great system of indicator, that has an area from the university that is dedicated to measure it, so you can understand the complexity of it. And every 2 years they provide a report. So going back then, once you have all these possibility of indicators, you have to do a selection of which ones are the most feasible. So once you have the ones that are the most feasible ones for Mexico, we identified that we're like 48 indicators. Then we needed to prepare the methodological sheets. And here, I wanted to provide you here the example. What we did was a matrix in Excel. Well, later I can show you also the matrix. What we did is a matrix in Excel where we had the theme, the sub-theme, the indicative purpose, the indicator, which is here. It was an indicator of impact. And here, I don't know if you have as a basic knowledge of indicators, but the easiest like impact indicator. In the impact indicators, it talks about the efficiency, and this is a very complex matter. And then later here I have, here I put here about the area. In the same matrix I put the axis of the national strategy plan. So that was the system, but I think I don't have more time to show it. So, but what is the experience and what is the summary of what I wanted to explain? Yes, I know but I think there's no problem if I tell you a matrix of the indicators. If I send you through Lily and through Dennis the example of these, of an example of a system of indicators. What I was trying to tell you is like these integrated indicator systems are being built, so it is very important to see how this process is being done in other countries. You need to respond to the local needs, but these local needs change in different countries, but also sometimes they change in the different regions. This is something very important. You cannot build system of indicators in 1 month or 2 months. It requires a whole process, and sometimes it takes at least 6 months in my experience, 6 or 1 year, 6 months or 1 year, and because you need a community, a learning community for that. There are many supplies. My main recommendation is look for those supplies, or because we need, for all the different themes or sub-themes that we choose, we need to understand what is the link of the theme or sub-theme with the adaptation. So the question has to be like, what is this theme is telling me if we are adapting or not? It's not just like putting that indicator. It is about asking about the question and that they can answer if we are adapting. So there are indicators that can tell us about the exposition. Those are the easier ones, about what percentage of population live next to the ocean. There are some indicators that tell me about the so there are other types of indicators. And also we need resources, we need capabilities, and many agreements. I'm sorry, because I know that this finishes at 10:30, and I know that I passed the time already, but basically this is what basically that's my experience. If you want to make some questions, if I could share really quickly, I don't know, well, that's okay. I'll just like send you the Excel sheet so you can see it, and then I can answer some questions. Well, you can ask me questions about the Excel. I can send you my email, or if you want to later, we can talk about the Excel sheet or the indicators. But I think, Lily, that I already passed my time. Is that okay? Is that right? Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, we are finishing this webinar, so we can provide some minutes for questions from the participants. With that, I just wanted to open the session of questions and answers. While we're waiting for some of your questions on the chat, I'm just going to pass to Maria if you wanted to provide some final conclusions or some lessons learned to finish your exposition. So I will thank all the participants. If you could write your questions so we can have these minutes to answer them from the different speakers. Okay, thank you very much. So now I'm going to pass to Maria to finish. Yes, I'm going to send you the Excel sheet, definitely, so I just need to adjust it to send it. I think that the way we can share this information is I can send you the Excel, maybe with some examples, or maybe, and you can use it if you mention it. Okay. Also, I wanted to mention that at national level, I already gave the conclusions, but if I can talk a little bit more, is that the complexity about preparing indicators of gender indicators, it is even more difficult for adaptation, because what I understood when I was trying to do those systems of indicators, that if we don't have a good diagnosis, we cannot select the indicators, the relevant indicators. And it's not just regarding gender, it's for everything. So that's my first recommendation. To do a system of indicators, clearly you need to start from a good diagnosis of the vulnerability conditions and the resilience conditions. We have the first question. What criteria do we need to use to prioritize these indicators? So prioritizing the indicators, it's very important, but there are indicators that they are self-eliminated. What are the ones that self-eliminate? The ones that are really expensive. We can have indicators that are beautiful, you can measure the percentage of species that have changed the life cycle. I don't know, I'm just saying something. But if there's no one that can measure it, then the indicator is deleted. Because if that's going to charge, it's going to cost us like research of thousands of dollars. And then we have to delete that indicator. So the first criteria is feasibility. Are you going to be able to measure it in the time? We're going to have this clarity of the process. It stays. Otherwise, we have to delete the indicator. Other indicators that they provide relevant information. Sometimes they could be like really easy indicators. We've discussed a lot about the about the education indicators. How relevant it is important for a population to read. For example, if an urban area where most of the population they talk about, I have an indicator of a reading indicator, but if it's not important. But if I put it in a rural area, it is more important. It is relevant. That's why we need to consider if the indicator is relevant. When we have the diagnosis more clear indicators, okay. I don't know if I answer your question. Quantitative and qualitative, all indicators are quantitative and qualitative, even indicators that don't have a measure. They can, in the case of capabilities, what we've developed is that for both adaptative measures and also when we're doing the measures, we build indicators with base of the experience of people who are working on the topic, and we change to measure. So we can quantitative anything that it's well done. And the qualitative comes from the narrative. So a number, or maybe 15 numbers, are just a quantitative measure, but it can be very powerful. But it's more powerful the narrative and the history that we provide to that group of indicators. So it is very important to group qualitative and quantitative. How to identify the link? Okay, based on the diagnosis, when we have a good diagnosis about vulnerability and the conditions of resilience and the possibilities of adaptation, we need to know what are the different topics that are important for our locality. For example, I was given the topic of education, but we can also provide about the system, production systems. That could change from population to population. So the explicit link can be based on from different questions. This topic, it's important to understand the vulnerability, the exposition, and the capabilities. This topic is about I'm going a little bit fast. So this topic talks about resilience. So right now, imagine any topic that interests you. For example, vegetation, for example. I've been told that the collectivity of vegetation is important. What is its link to the adaptation? What tells me that there's a link between that and the resilience of the ecosystems? If I know if there's like connectivity, maybe I know that there's going to be there's going to be a migration, that the flow of water is going to be okay. But that's that's the type of questions that we need to make. Okay, Nick. The management indicators are very important when we are focusing on impact indicators. We need management indicators are very important as well. A management indicator is the percentage of coverage of the information of the climate information or the climate station. It is an impact indicator. It is not telling us if adaptation is changing, but it is telling us what are the elements that we do have in order to know the climate information. So they are important. For example, some of the management indicators that doesn't measure the adaptive measures, but it is important number of courses or trainings that have been given. The management indicator is, for example, we train 50 localities. That is not really telling me if I change the perspective or the knowledge about adaptation in the localities, but at least it's telling me that I'm doing some work. So the indicator, the management indicator, has to be done maybe together with an impact indicator, because capabilities are very difficult to measure, because you will need to understand from what you are starting and how this knowledge is changing. But both are also important. So I think we need to have also management indicators and also an impact indicator for sub-theme of adaptation that interests us. To do well, there's a contribution here based on, I do recommend you the publications of the USCN, the adaptation based on ecosystem. There's a very good one that it's really small. It's in Spanish. It's from Ecuador. That it's a very good one. I can send you the material as well. How to strengthen social and government capabilities with integration of indicators. Well, the capabilities is a very difficult topic, because really we need to develop capabilities in all areas, and we are not really investing much in the monitoring of this. So how can you build on capabilities? Generate processes for it. When you generate a process in which different players work on, that process also has implicit training. Since the first presentation, what is an indicator? You're already generating capabilities, but it's also important to develop the capabilities of dialogue and consensus in the different adaptation processes. But also, I think the development of capabilities is a really broad theme that we haven't talked about in the different countries, and we need to work on that. In environmental education, there's many things that we can do to transmit information. How we can distinguish adaptation to the climate change and environmental management has a lot of topics. Environmental management, if we see as any public policy focus on environment, for example, there are different topics and it has everything that has to be done with public policy. Adaptation takes one part of the environment public policy that needs to be properly focused. It is important that adaptation has four things. If we're going to do adaptation, two. If we're going to do adaptation, one or two, or we're going to reduce vulnerability, explicitly we have to reduce vulnerability, and this vulnerability we can see in the explosions, or we can increase our resilience. So there are many things of environment management that it's not focused on adaptation, but there are some things that, yes, they are. And adaptation is more than just environment and management. It has to do a lot with social capabilities, production capabilities as well, with institutional capabilities that surpass the environment management. So the process of adaptation has to do with all the integration of the different players that are working on this. So it's a multi-player process. It's like sustainability. I realized that adaptation was very close to sustainability. So it is very complex. I don't know if someone has another question. I'm sorry that I was too fast. Sorry, it's just that I know that I'm with the time. Thank you very much to Maria for answering all the different questions. I can see here another question. Unfortunately, we have to finish with this webinar. So if there are some questions from the participants that couldn't ask, or maybe they couldn't receive an answer to the questions, well, I see that Maria has shared also her email address. With this, I would like to thank the participation of our different speakers, Elena Pita, Lars Christensen, and Maria Zorrilla Ramos, for their excellent expositions and for providing an overview, a theoric overview about the challenges and opportunities of developing adaptation evaluation, like identifying the metrics, and also this experience from Mexico that is giving us more information about the advances, the progress, and the steps that we can go in order to progress in that topic and supports the implementation. Well, thank you very much to the speakers, and also I would like to thank the participants who could stay until the end of this presentation, and excuses for the different audio difficulties. So we invite you to continue to follow us on the next webinars. Well, thank you very much, and bye.